is Radio Prague International, coming to you from the Czech capital.
Hi there, listener. This is Radio Prague International with me, Vít Pohanka. Prague and Warsaw have responded to a disinformation campaign falsely claiming Poland planned to seize Czech territory. Beavers fighting drought in Czechia are ecosystem engineers, says zoologist. And former President Václav Klaus says Czechia needs to desubsidize its economy. But first, here is the news.
News.
The Czech economy grew by 1.9% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2026, according to figures released by the Czech Statistical Office on Friday. The office slightly revised down its preliminary estimate of 2% growth published at the end of July. Compared with the previous quarter, gross domestic product increased by 0.4%. Household and government consumption, investment and foreign trade all contributed positively to year-on-year growth, while changes in inventories had a negative impact. Incoming Czech ambassador to the United States, Jakub Kulhánek, says maintaining what he described as exceptionally strong relations between Prague and Washington will be his main priority. He said he would focus on concrete projects, including trade agreements and investment, pointing to the growing presence of major Czech companies in the United States. Kulhánek also said Czech diplomatic missions should strengthen links with the roughly 1.3 million Americans who claim Czech ancestry. A new Czech consulate general is due to open in Miami in October. Kulhánek previously served as Czech ambassador to the United Nations. Czechia will provide 2.5 million Czech crowns in humanitarian aid to Nepal following devastating flash floods and landslides near the border with Tibet. Foreign Minister Petr Matsinka of the Motorists' Party approved the assistance on Thursday. Nepalese police say at least 469 people have died and hundreds remain missing after Wednesday's disaster, which was apparently triggered by a glacier collapse. The Czech Foreign Ministry says it has no information about any Czech citizens among the dead or missing. 21 people are registered as being in Nepal through the ministry's drought travel system. Czech Interior Minister Lubomír Metnar from the ANO party and his Austrian counterpart Gerhard Karner have called for stronger protection of both the EU's external borders and their country's shared border. Meeting at the Czech-Austrian Police Cooperation Center near Mikulov in South Moravia on Friday, the ministers discussed illegal migration, people smuggling and EU migration policy. They also praised the center, which has facilitated cross-border police cooperation since 2006. Austria introduced controls on its border with Czechia in 2023 and extended them again in June, while shifting towards more flexible checks aimed primarily at smugglers and criminals. Arms industry entrepreneur Michal Strnad remains the richest Czech according to Euro magazine's latest ranking. The owner of the CSG Group has an estimated fortune of 470 billion Czech crowns, or nearly $23 billion. He is followed by energy businessman Daniel Křetínský with 432 billion crowns and PPF owner Renata Kellnerová and her family with 385 billion Czech crowns, or nearly $19 billion. The combined wealth of the 100 richest Czechs and Slovaks rose by almost a fifth to more than 4 trillion Czech crowns, or $193 billion. Prime Minister Andrej Babiš's family ranked 8th, with wealth estimated at 83.5 billion Czech crowns, or about $4 billion. A partial lunar eclipse was visible over Czechia early on Friday morning. The eclipse began at around 4:33 a.m., with the Earth's shadow eventually covering up to 93% of the Moon's diameter. The maximum phase occurred shortly before 6:13 a.m., as the Moon was already approaching the horizon. The phenomenon could be observed with the naked eye in places with clear skies, with the best viewing conditions in the southwest of the country. According to the Czech Astronomical Society, the next total lunar eclipse visible from Czechia will occur on New Year's Eve 2028. It will be partly cloudy to cloudy, with isolated showers, with temperatures ranging between 21 and 26 degrees Celsius. Polish and Czech officials have been highlighting the country's positive relations in response to a disinformation campaign claiming Poland wanted to seize Czech territory. Media reports say security officials in both states suspect Russia is behind the incident. Ian Willoughby reports.
On Wednesday, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk put out an unusual social media post. A cute illustration showed Poland's Reksio animated dog and Czech cartoon character Little Mole smiling together at the two states' mutual border. Reksio and Krtek have known this for ages, wrote Mr. Tusk in Czech. Poland and Czechia are true friends. The previous day, Czech news outlet Seznam Zprávy had reported that a disinformation campaign was falsely claiming that Poland was seeking to seize a small area of Czech territory in Silesia. This land was awarded to the Czechs in a settlement to a conflict stemming from 1938, and the two sides have long sought to resolve the dispute. Seznam Zprávy said that security officials in both Warsaw and Prague suspected that Russia was behind the deceit. The campaign included a dummy Czech news site, a falsified social media account of Czechia's ambassador to Warsaw, and a suspicious-looking Czech organised demonstration purportedly set for this Saturday. Alongside positive proclamations issued in Poland, the Foreign Ministry here in Prague put out a post on Thursday saying the neighbouring state was among Czechia's closest and most important partners. I discussed the whole issue with Viktor Daněk, an analyst with Czech Radio's Plus station.
It's quite sophisticated, I would say. It's not just a random thing that would appear and then fade away. It was a coordinated campaign, I would even say, where there was part of diplomatic communication that was fake, obviously, that was published on a news portal, also fake, mimicking our own Czech Radio's news portal. There were a couple of groups on Facebook spreading this fake news, and there were even calls on Facebook for a demonstration in Třinec, in eastern part of Czechia, against the supposed move by Poland to seize part of Czechia's territory, which is utter nonsense, obviously. But anyway, this is not a joke or some random attack. This is obviously a coordinated operation abusing an existing dispute between Czechia and Poland, however, dispute that is there for a long time, and that is definitely not going to be solved by means of force.
I noticed that this seemed to get more attention in Poland, and there were more statements from the Poles. Tusk, Sikorski, and the Foreign Ministry, they all posted about it. Here, there seemed to be less response. Why do you think that might be?
Partially because Poland in this story is the supposed aggressor, the one who wants to seize territory by force, which is not true. Radoslav Sikorski, you mentioned, he noted on X, or reminded that the fact that Poland in the past, in 1938, annexed part of Czechoslovakia territory was one of the stupidest thing of Polish foreign policy in history. So I think there's this historical context that is more sensitive, even for Poland than for Czechia nowadays, I would say.
The whole thing made me think, if Moscow really is behind this, on how many fronts are they operating in the information war?
It's bizarre how much work and effort they are willing to put into something that's obviously ridiculous. But they do this systematically over and over again, everywhere throughout Europe. When you read annual reports by security services, this is precisely Russian tactics, to use any opportunity there is to seed distrust among EU member states, to use any possibility there is to just break European unity. And if there's a actually existing legal dispute between the two states, then just let's use it. This is part of Russian tactics, and that's obviously, if Russians are behind it, and everything seems that they are, who else would do this? It absolutely fits into the tactics and to the rule book we saw everywhere.
That was Ian Willoughby reporting. Despite the rainier days in the second half of August, the Czech Republic continues to face a long-term moisture deficit. One solution that can significantly help combat drought is beaver dams. Romana Grajcarová has more.
Soutok Protected Landscape Area is located at Czechia's border with Austria and Slovakia, close to the town of Břeclav. While the surrounding landscape is parched, beaver dams retain water in wetlands, pools, and parts of meadows. This allows rare plants and animals to survive there. Conservationists estimate that around 500 beavers live in the Soutok and nearby Podluží areas. According to zoologist Rudolf Jureček, the significant presence of beavers in the area can be identified based on their scent markers.
Masové města, kde si teda značkuje teritorium, to jsou také kopčeky z hliny.
They have a place where they mark their territory. These are little mounds made of soil and vegetation, onto which they leave a scent marker from their anal glands. It has a rather distinctive smell. The beaver is an ecosystem engineer. It doesn't ask anyone and doesn't need any permits. But especially during periods of drought, it's an important factor that can locally retain water and improve the condition of habitats.
Beaver dams can range from several dozen centimeters to as much as 2 meters in height.
Nie je to čisto len drevená stavba, jak si mnohí predstavujú.
The structure is not entirely made of wood. Wood is only the foundation. The beaver seals it with clumps of aquatic plants or mud, particularly in places where the water would otherwise flow through. It packs the material down with its front paws, creating a kind of mud seal.
Thanks to beavers, some meadows in the area are flooded with water. What may seem like an inconvenience to people is actually essential for nature and many diverse species. Wet meadows are the only habitat where certain species can survive. One of them is a crimson plant known as great burnet. Rudolf Jureček again.
Aj tu ho všade vidíme, taká zvláštna rastlina, vyzerá to ako keby to už...
We can see it everywhere here. It's quite an unusual plant. It looks as if it's already finished flowering with these red seed heads. The scarce large blue is a species of butterfly that depends on it. It's its only host plant.
Je to jediná jeho hostiteľská rastlina.
According to water management specialist Ondřej Berka, drought has affected areas this year that even long-time residents cannot remember ever seeing dry.
Jedna epizoda sucha nenapáchá nic.
One individual episode of drought doesn't cause much damage. What's worse is if these catastrophic droughts we're experiencing now continue to occur repeatedly. What we call catastrophic drought today could become a normal summer in 20 years.
Za 20 roků to bude normální léto.
As scientists point out, if droughts continue over the long term, the composition of plant and animal species in the area will change. And although beavers could help, the question remains whether they will be able to survive at all under such changed and inhospitable conditions.
That report was by Romana Grajcarová. Now, in the final part of our program, we bring you an interview with former President Václav Klaus. Now 85, he remains a highly visible, even if polarizing figure in Czech public debate, known, among other things, for his deeply skeptical and often controversial views on climate change and policies designed to combat it. We sat down with him in his think tank, Institute of Václav Klaus, in Prague. Now, more than 35 years after the fall of communism, how close is this country to the vision you would have together with your, I will say, collaborators, together with your team, back in the early 1990s, or how far is it from that vision?
You know, there are definitely two phases, two stages. In the first part, especially the 1990s, was really the move towards freedom and free society, free markets, free economy. And in the middle of the last 35 years, it has radically changed, and we are moving in the opposite direction, to my great regret. So I teach the course on transformation of the Czech economy at the Prague School of Economics, and I think almost it's time to take a new course, to start a new course with with describing the opposites development, which is mostly the result of our submission to the directives coming from Brussels, from the European Union, but our own mistakes.
But having said that, now we have a government where Mr. Matsinka, who used to be your spokesperson, is now an important member. He's the deputy prime minister. Aren't there at least some kind of signals, that the society is, reconsidering?
It was a signal, and I know that many people were extremely happy with that. I'm afraid that the new government has not been delivering what we expected from the government, and it's partly the question external, partly internal. Internal is that there are three different parties, and especially the most important one, ANO, run by Mr. Prime Minister Babiš, is really different from Mr. Matsinka ideologically, and that's one issue. But the second issue is the irrational, unnecessary fight between the government and the president, which really destroys the rationality of Czech politics, to my great regret.
You maybe indicated that, but when do you think the vision that you talked about, having free society, liberal economy, when did it start to change towards this trend, do you think?
As I said, it changed very slowly, but the main impulse for that was really the attempts to satisfy the EU authorities and to let the Czech Republic to enter the EU as members. That process helped. On the other hand, I don't overestimate the strengths of liberal in classical sense, liberal ideas here. Everyone was against communism, but it doesn't mean that everyone was for free markets and free society.
It's great that you mentioned that, because after spending some time in the United States, it was so difficult for me to explain that when I use the word liberal, I mean something completely different than what they mean.
We have always had problems with using the term liberal. At the beginning, I always stressed liberal in classical sense. Now I'm afraid that even that term is difficult to explain to anyone.
And that means basically more free market, if I say so. Basically the economy based on the ideas of free market and free enterprise. Yeah, that's the formal sense.
I would say that the economy now becomes so regulated, administered from above, that it resembles in many respects the era of late communism. In this respect, I really differentiate the 1950s from the end of communism, so don't trivialize the issue. But I always remember the famous German economist who after the Nazi era published a famous Walter Eucken published a famous article about the centrally administered economy, not centrally planned economy. And I must say, when I discovered that paper 50 years, half a century ago, I understood this is the point. It's not necessary to have central planning. it's sufficient to have central administration of the economy, and this is the case just now again.
I think that what I hear from the business organizations like Chamber of Commerce and the Czech Association of Transport, Trade and Industry, I think is the official title in English. This is exactly what they mentioned. There's too much bureaucracy, kind of attempts to centrally direct the economy. At the same time, all these organizations openly support acceptance of euro and Czechia coming to Eurozone. You are very well-known opponent of that, and you are not alone. Majority of Czech society is against euro. Why do you think is that?
Two issues.
Complain on one side, if you understand what I...
You put two questions, bureaucracy and euro, the common currency. Let's say these two issues, I would differentiate them. Even in the communist era, you were too young to understand that the bureaucracy was the very popular term in the communist press, in the communist media. It was allowed to criticize bureaucracy because it was not the criticism of the substance of the system. So criticizing bureaucracy was really allowed in the communist era. It was a standard issue because it was the allowed criticism. No one was able to criticize the substance of the communist system, and I'm afraid that the institutions you mentioned, the Chamber of Commerce and similar institutions are very close to what we remember from the communist era. So they criticize bureaucracy because, again, they are not able to criticize the problems in the nature of the system, in the substance of the system.
Czechia today.
And the second issue was the common currency. There is almost nothing new to add to the issue. For an economist, we discussed the issue of common currency under the title homogeneity or non-homogeneity of the area where the currency should be done. So we think that I think, and I'm convinced that Europe is not the currency for one currency, because that would be irrational to introduce one currency to different countries and so different economically different countries. So I think it is a wrong idea to have euro.
Okay. Czechia today has by the way, what do you think about the name Czechia?
I hate it. I would never use it.
Okay, I say Czech Republic today has a much larger welfare state and more regulation than in the 1990s. Now, I don't know how much you like or dislike questions, what if, but if you had the power to change now something, where would you start? Because you were the one who was really the proponent of economic transformation then after the years of communism. Where do you see the steps that should be needed now?
I remember the whole transformation after communism was done with four slogans: to liberalize, to deregulate, to privatize, and this is the point, to desubsidize, because communism was based on all kinds of subsidies because of the irrationality of prices. So prices didn't reflect anything and didn't represent anything. Therefore, all kinds of grant subsidies were absolutely inevitable. That was the definition of the communist economy in a deeper sense. So I would start with desubsidizing, which is also the only way how to balance the budget in the Czech Republic.
You've been quite for a long time critic of the European Union in its present form. Do you still believe that it could be fundamentally reformed, or do you see that as something, permanent, here to stay?
Well, I think it's not necessary to have a revolution where the blood is running, definitely not. So I don't expect anything like that in Europe. But again, to reform, after the fall of communism, again, as I said, it was quite normal to discuss bureaucracy. It was quite normal to suggest reforms. But reform was not a transition, was not a fundamental change of the substance of the both political and economic systems. Therefore, we, after the fall of communism, I refused using the term reform, because it was so misused in the past. So now I would say that European Union needs something more than a reform, what is usually understood by this term. It needs a fundamental change, fundamental systemic restructuring.
You still travel a lot, I think. Do you see forces in Europe that could bring about that change in European Union?
I am not very optimistic in this respect. I must confess. It's also difficult to do it at the European level, because there is no European Union is not a real entity similar to the nation states. In the European Union there is really no democracy. This is not a cheap criticism, but there can't be democracy in the EU, because in the EU there is no substantial point for democracy, which is demos, the people. I don't think that we are Europeans as inhabitants of the continent of Europe. We may eventually be a cultural entity, but we are not a nation, and therefore there is no demos in the European Union. So therefore the elections have not the same meaning as in a nation state, and so on and so on.
That was Václav Klaus speaking to Radio Prague International. You will find the full unabridged version of the interview on Czechcast, our podcast in English about all things Czech, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And it's all we have time for on Radio Prague International today. From me, Vít Pohanka, thanks for listening, and talk to you again very soon.